They said she died with her eyes open, staring at something no one else could see. That's how the story begins in Mobile, Alabama, a city that still sweats secrets through its brick walls. February 1843. The air hung heavy with the perfume of magnolia and blood. Cotton money ruled the harbor, and beneath its whitewashed mansions, chains rattled in rhythm with piano music. The polite society of Mobile smiled by day and sinned by candlelight. And in one of those houses, behind a carved mahogany door, two souls broke the laws of their time and paid a price no one could measure. Their names were Abram Hollis and Delilah Morrow, one a free man of color, the other an enslaved maid whose quiet intelligence caught every cruel eye. Their love wasn't supposed to exist, not in 1843, not in the South, not under God as the judges there defined him. Abram was a craftsman, a man who shaped beauty from wood, dignity from labor. He'd bought his own freedom with his hands, building furniture for the very people who still owned others. Delilah, born into bondage, had been gifted to the Morrow family as if she were a piece of jewelry. She read in secret, wrote in whispers, and carried herself like someone who remembered another life. Maybe one that never existed. They met the way forbidden stories always begin, by accident, in the shadow of faith. Christmas service, candlelight, the hush between hymns, one glance across a church aisle. Something ancient passed between them, not lust, but recognition. Two souls who'd seen too much of the world's cruelty and still dared to dream it could be gentler. But dreams are dangerous when your skin defines your sentence. For years they met in silence. A carved token here, a sprig of time there, secret codes between them, until the day that love turned from sacred to lethal. Rumors began to whisper through Mobile's coffeehouses. About a craftsman and a slave girl, letters passed, a plan to escape. And in the South of 1843, that wasn't gossip. That was death. The accusation came from Philippe Morrow, the son of Delilah's master, a man born into privilege but hollowed by greed. He said Abram had plotted to steal property. He said Delilah was conspiring to flee, and in a society built on ownership of bodies, even whispers of freedom were treated like fire in a powder room. By nightfall, Abram was dragged from his workshop, the same hands that carved beauty now bound by iron. Delilah was locked in the cellar of the Morrow estate. The law was clear. If a white man accused, a black soul must hang. But this story doesn't end at the gallows, because something else was happening inside that house, something darker, more deliberate. The master, Jean-Baptiste Morrow, had fallen ill weeks earlier. His health deteriorated with every dose of... They never wrote about the letter his sister had sent, warning their mother that Philippe had been studying poisons. History has a habit of hiding the truth behind polite lies. When Abram heard of Delilah's sentence, he begged the judge to let him speak, to confess, to take her place, anything. The judge refused. The verdict had been bought long before the trial began. Delilah was hanged in the courthouse square. They say she looked out at the crowd, searching for someone, and when her eyes found Abram, she smiled. No fear, no shame, only defiance. And as the rope tightened, a small wooden bird fell from her sleeve, carved by the same hands that once touched her cheek. They buried it with her, but years later, when the earth shifted, the bird was gone. No one knows who took it. But some say on quiet nights in old Mobile, a faint tapping echoes from beneath the ground, like the sound of a chisel carving wood. That's where the story should have ended. But history doesn't bury truth. It buries evidence. Because decades later, when the Morrow estate was demolished, workers found something sealed beneath a floorboard, a tin box, a dried sprig of thyme, and a note in Delilah's handwriting. They say he poisoned his father slowly. I found the bottles. If you find this, know that I loved you, and that whatever happens is not your doing. D. The handwriting was delicate, but the message cut like a blade. She had seen everything. She had known the real killer, and for that knowledge, she was erased. Now ask yourself, who benefits when the innocent are silenced? Who writes the history books when truth is too dangerous to tell? The ones who build the gallows, or the ones who hang from them? Before we continue, I want you to comment this phrase twice. I will not look away. Type it, twice, because once you see how deep this deception goes, you won't be the same man you were before. Mobile was a city of illusions. By day, it shone like a jewel of southern prosperity, a place where merchant ships kissed the Gulf and polished boots clicked down marble corridors. But beneath its civility ran the slow pulse of rot. The men who spoke of honor by candlelight also trafficked in blood by dawn. They built churches to hide their sins, wrote laws to bless their appetites, and baptized cruelty in the language of commerce. In 1843, Mobile's elite had turned morality into architecture, grand facades of virtue concealing rooms filled with decay. Every mansion carried secrets, but the Marrow estate carried more than most. The rooms were scented with imported tobacco and death. Jean-Baptiste Marrow's business empire had been built on sugar, cotton, and people. His wealth came from bondage, yet his reputation glowed with philanthropy. He donated to churches, funded orphanages, and claimed piety before priests who never dared ask where his gold was born. The city called him the benevolent patriarch. But those who worked his docks whispered another name, the leech of the bay. His son Philippe was the mirror turned inward, elegant, educated, and empty. His ambition was a hunger that could not be sated. The old man's illness was not unexpected. In homes like these, death was a form of inheritance. But when his decline accelerated, when the new medicine began to burn his throat, only Delilah saw the pattern forming. She served the family with silence, yet her eyes recorded everything: the bitter scent of the tonic, the tremor in Philippe's hand when he poured it, the smile he forced when his father coughed blood into his napkin. Delilah's knowledge was her death sentence long before the trial began. In Mobile, truth was not a virtue. It was contraband. For a black woman to speak against a white man was to commit spiritual treason. Every institution was designed to silence her before she even opened her mouth. The church preached obedience, the court enforced property, and the press performed the final absolution, printing whatever story the powerful required. When the accusation fell, it landed perfectly. A convenient moral play. The master poisoned by his servant, the noble son mourning his fallen father, and the city rallying behind justice. What no one noticed, or pretended not to, was how quickly the narrative aligned itself with Philippe's inheritance. Before the elder Marrow was cold in the ground, the estate had transferred. Land titles rewritten, bank accounts shifted, a family tragedy had become a transaction, and through it all, Mobile watched and applauded. This was not corruption, it was the system functioning as intended. The city thrived on two currencies, cotton and silence. It required both to maintain its illusion of order. The judges drank with the merchants, the priests dined with the slavers, and the newspapers folded truth into polite fiction. Those who questioned too loudly simply vanished from conversation. Their stories faded, their graves unmarked. Abram Hollis was one of the few who dared remember. After Delilah's death, he became a ghost within the city he once built furniture for. Every door he had carved now felt like a coffin lid. He wandered the alleys at night, tracing the paths they once walked together, seeing her reflection in every gas lamp's flicker. He tried to appeal to reason, to the judge who had once praised his skill, to the church that had blessed their secret meetings, but reason in Mobile had a color, and it was not his. When the hangman's rope claimed Delilah, it claimed more than her life. It claimed the city's last chance, be it honesty. The crowd that watched her execution wasn't merely witnessing punishment, they were witnessing purification, the removal of a reminder. In the public square, beneath the oak branches where sermons were sometimes preached, the city burned its conscience and called it righteousness. Years later, when Mobile's wealth began to decay under the weight of its own lies, people said the city was cursed. Fires consumed warehouses. Yellow fever ravaged neighborhoods. Ships sank inexplicably in calm weather. The old families scattered north, their fortunes dissolving like salt in rain. But the curse was not supernatural. It was historical. A wound that had been hidden too long had begun to fester. Behind the crumbling walls of the Morrow house, servants whispered of footsteps on the upper floors long after the family had moved out. A woman's silhouette pacing near the windows, the faint scent of thyme drifting through rooms where no herbs grew. Workers refused to stay past dusk. They said the house breathed, that sometimes in the quiet before dawn you could hear wood creaking, not from decay, but from carving, as if someone was shaping something in the dark. To understand Mobile, you must understand this. Evil doesn't always arrive with horns and fire. It dresses in white gloves and polished boots. It quotes scripture. It smiles. The city was not built by monsters. It was built by men who believed they were good, and that is the most terrifying truth of all. As the decades passed, the Morrow estate collapsed into memory, but its design, the architecture of deceit, spread across America. Systems of respectability shielding brutality. Institutions wearing the mask of morality while feeding on submission. The story of Delilah and Abram was a prototype of control replicated in every place where power fears equality. The tragedy of Mobile is that it didn't end in 1843. It evolved. The names changed, the methods refined, but the structure remained. History doesn't repeat. It upgrades. By the time Abram fled north, the lesson had burned itself into him. Justice was not blind, it was selective. And those who see the pattern must either flee or vanish. He chose exile. But some nights, in his small Philadelphia workshop, he would carve wooden birds by candlelight. Each one identical, each one hollow. Inside, he hid scraps of paper covered in tiny handwriting, memories of a woman whose truth was too dangerous to speak. That's where we'll go next, into those letters, into what Abram tried to preserve when the world demanded silence. Because within his secret carvings lay a message the city of Mobile never wanted uncovered. When Abram reached Philadelphia, the world felt colder, not just in weather, but in soul. He had escaped the South's chains, but not its shadow. Every hammer strike echoed like a heartbeat he could not silence. In the daylight he worked, building furniture for northern merchants who congratulated themselves for their abolitionist virtue, unaware that the man sanding their tables carried ghosts in his breath. But when night fell, he returned to the single room he called home, lit one candle, and carved. At first it was habit, his hands remembering the rhythm that had once earned him freedom. But soon the carvings became messages. Birds, leaves, stars, small wooden relics with hollow centers. Inside each, a folded piece of paper. No one knew of them. No one was meant to. They were letters for the dead. He addressed every note to the same name. Delilah. The words were not confessions. They were invocations. He spoke to her like she was not gone, only waiting. "They think you ended," one letter began, "but I hear you in the creak of every tree. The rope did not silence you. It planted you." Each carving held a different fragment of their story, moments the world refused to acknowledge. The Christmas service where their eyes first met, the taste of rain when she risked a whisper. The night he nearly fled, but turned back at the thought of her alone. Through these letters, Abram built an archive that history would never authorize, a hidden scripture of love, guilt, and defiance. But there was something else encoded in the carvings, a pattern. Each bird's wings bore tiny symbols, dots, lines, crescents. At first glance, decoration. But under the candle's light, Abram saw rhythm, a language only he understood. Later, scholars who examined the surviving carvings called it a cipher of grief. But to Abram, it was survival. He feared forgetting, and memory in that age was rebellion. For years, he buried the carvings inside walls, under floorboards, within the furniture he sold. He once wrote, "If truth cannot live in open air, let it live inside the wood." Some of those pieces, chairs, cabinets, boxes, still stand in antique shops today. Their owners have no idea what they hold. One letter, dated 1851, was the most haunting. "I dreamt of Mobile again," he wrote. "The city stood in sunlight, but every shadow wore your face. They called it progress, but I saw the same ropes waiting, painted gold this time. They tell me freedom lives here, but men still sell their conscience for comfort. Maybe the North only hides its cruelty better." By the time he neared 60, his hair silvered and his eyes dimmed, Abram had built more than furniture. He had built a philosophy. In his final letters he wrote not of love, but of systems. They teach obedience through guilt. They keep peace through fear. They rewrite God to resemble their reflection. And when one dares to love freely, they call it sin. He believed that the poison that killed Jean-Baptiste Marot was not confined to one house. It was an inheritance that bled through generations, infecting every institution that mistook dominance for order. In 1865, when the Civil War ended and the South burned in the name of unity, Abram didn't celebrate. He wrote instead, "They have traded one chain for another. The iron will rust, but the idea remains." His final carving, a small wooden bird, unlike the others, was found decades later in a church attic in Philadelphia. It was sealed tight, and when opened, contained no letter, only a single line carved into the hollow. "She lives in the silence between lies." No historian could explain what he meant, but the priests who handled it claimed that when the box was first opened, the scent of time filled the air. That was how Abram's life closed, not with vengeance, but with quiet defiance. He refused to forget, and through that refusal he defied death itself. His carvings were more than memorials. They were resistance disguised as craftsmanship, each one a confession no court could punish, a prayer no preacher could censor. And yet, even as he tried to preserve her, the system that destroyed Delilah adapted. It changed masks again. The plantation became the factory. The overseer became the foreman. The church sermons turned into speeches about manifest destiny. The belief remained the same, that some lives exist to serve and others to rule. This is how control survives, by shape-shifting. It doesn't vanish when exposed. It evolves when ignored. The world Abram built in had merely traded whips for wages, auctions for contracts, chains for papers. But the design, hidden hierarchy cloaked in moral language, remained untouched. History never tells you this because history belongs to the victors. They let you hear the melody but never the lyrics. They tell you Delilah was guilty, Abram was broken, and the city moved on. But if you look close enough, if you listen between the words, you hear the deeper rhythm, the one carried in Abram's carvings. Before we descend further, look at your own world. The screens, the headlines, the promises. Tell me you don't recognize the pattern. Tell me we aren't still living in the city of masks, only digital now, not marble. And if you see it, if you truly see it, then you already know what comes next. Power does not vanish, it adapts. That was the lesson written between every line of Abram's hidden letters. The plantation was never just a field, it was a laboratory. It was where human obedience was engineered, refined, and perfected. Every chain, every whip, every law was a prototype for the psychological systems that still surround us today. Those who ruled the South were not only masters of bodies, they were architects of minds. And when the age of slavery ended, their blueprints did not burn. They were inherited, repurposed, disguised beneath new words: patriotism, productivity, civilization, faith. The anatomy of control begins with belief. A man who believes his chains keep him safe will guard them himself. In the 1840s, yet the scales remained the same, always tilted, always unreachable. The plantation became the factory, the overseer became the manager, and submission was baptized as virtue. What Abram understood, though he never wrote it plainly, was that power survives through perception. When you control what a man sees, you no longer need chains to control what he does. The masters of his time used scripture and status. The masters of ours use screens and systems. The illusion has evolved, but the goal remains identical: to shape human behavior through invisible architecture. Think of how mobile's hierarchy functioned. At the top, a few names decided reality. They defined what was moral, who was valuable, what was legal. Their language created truth, and everyone else lived inside it. Today, the faces have changed, but the mechanism has not. We call them corporations, governments, institutions. They set narratives, shape markets, design technologies that listen more than they speak. Every click, every view, every transaction is a whisper into a machine that learns who you are until it knows you better than you know yourself. And then, just like the preachers of 1843, it tells you what to desire, who to fear, what to buy, whom to obey. Control thrives on invisibility. You can resist a whip you can see. You cannot fight a voice that sounds like your own. The genius of the modern system is that it convinces you that you are free while scripting your every move. It rewards you for conformity, distracts you from rebellion, and calls it choice. Abram's age had physical overseers. Ours has algorithms. His masters carried ledgers. Ours carry data. The plantation gates have simply expanded to encompass the entire planet. Delilah's death was not only a tragedy of love, it was a demonstration. She had seen too much, questioned too openly, stepped beyond the narrative written for her. The sister, M, could not allow that. Her execution was more than punishment. It was theater, a message to every other soul who might dare to look behind the curtain. Fear, then as now, is the currency of compliance. Abram understood fear intimately. He lived in its shadow. Yet in carving those wooden birds, he created something the system could not quantify: memory, because control depends on amnesia. Every age of power begins by erasing the last resistance. Every regime rewrites the story to cast itself as savior. They did it in Mobile. They do it now. History is not a record. It is a product, edited and sold to maintain the illusion. Look closely at how that illusion works. Step 1. Divide the people. Convince one group they are chosen and another that they are cursed. Step 2. Create a moral justification for dominance, divine law, racial destiny, national pride. Step 3. Construct institutions that seem impartial but serve only those who built them. Step 4. When the oppressed begin to awaken, rebrand their cage as progress. Offer them new words: citizen, consumer, influencer, while the bars remain invisible. This is the true anatomy of control, a body with many faces and one purpose: stability through subjugation. It does not seek justice, it seeks continuity. It fears chaos more than evil, and it will sacrifice truth for order every time. Abram saw this in the way Judge Thompson's hands trembled when he signed the death warrant. The man was not cruel, he was complicit. He convinced himself he was powerless, when in truth, his silence was the system's strongest weapon. That's how control sustains itself, not through monsters, but through ordinary men who trade conscience for comfort. The overseer with a Bible, the judge with a pen, the citizen who looks away. And you, right now, are living inside the same architecture. You scroll through illusions, consume narratives, and ache information for truth. You are told what matters, what to fear, what to love. Your rebellion is predicted, prepackaged, monetized. The plantation learned to program its slaves through fear. The modern world programs its citizens through desire. Both are chains, one visible, one internal. Abram's letters warned of this. They teach us to choose our own leash, he wrote, to decorate it, defend it, and call it liberty. He knew that the deepest prison is the one you decorate yourself. Before you hear what comes next, I need you to do something. Stop scrolling. Look at the space around you. The lights, the walls, the screen reflecting your face. Ask yourself, how much of what you call freedom is designed convenience? How much of your peace is purchased obedience? If you feel something tightening in your chest as you ask, that's not fear. That's recognition. You are glimpsing the machinery that has been running for centuries. Type this phrase twice in the comments to anchor it in your mind. I see the pattern. Twice. Not for me, for you. Because awareness is the first fracture in control. Now we go deeper, into the mechanics of deception, into the way the ruling class learned to weaponize morality itself. That is where Abram's final letters lead. Every empire hides its cruelty inside a sermon. In Mobile, that sermon began in the pews, beneath stained glass depicting saints who never lived and martyrs who never spoke. The same pulpits that thundered about salvation also whispered instructions for subjugation. Scripture became policy. Faith became a leash. They called it obedience to God, but it was obedience to hierarchy. When Abram was a boy, he remembered the sound of the plantation bell, sharp, sacred, absolute. It rang for prayer, for labor, for punishment. The bell and the Bible spoke with the same voice. Obey, and you will be saved. The masters had learned something profound. If you can make a man believe his suffering pleases heaven, you never have to raise a whip again. The greatest invention of slavery was not the chain. It was guilt sanctified as virtue. In the churches of 1843, they quoted Ephesians, "Servants, obey your masters." They recited it with conviction, their hands trembling not from conscience but from fear of losing control. The congregation nodded, reassured that their cruelty was holy. Meanwhile, the enslaved knelt beneath the balcony, their eyes lowered, learning to whisper faith through gritted teeth. Religion was supposed to free the soul. In Mobile, it became a manual for ownership. Felipe Amaro understood this perfectly. When he accused Delilah, he did not just wield law, he wielded theology. He told the judge that her rebellion was not just against him, but against divine order. A black woman accused a white man. It was heresy. The crowd didn't see a trial. They saw a ritual cleansing. Her hanging was not a punishment. It was a sacrifice to maintain the illusion of cosmic balance. That is how the gospel of obedience works. It turns rebellion into sin and submission into salvation. It wraps tyranny in the language of redemption. And the most insidious part is how it teaches the oppressed to police themselves. You don't need guards when the prisoner prays for his own captivity. When Abram fled north, he tried to abandon faith, but faith followed him, disguised as respectability. In Philadelphia, he heard new sermons, ones that spoke of freedom but warned against anger. Be patient, they said. Trust God's timing. He recognized the tone. Different accent, same poison. The North had simply rebranded obedience as morality. He once wrote, "They teach humility to the hungry and call it peace." This is the hidden continuity of power. It changes the language, never the message. In the South, they used crosses. In the North, they used tracts. Today, they use corporate slogans and political slogans that promise salvation through obedience. Work harder. Buy this. Trust us. Confess your sins through algorithms. The form evolves, but the theology remains. You are not worthy until you serve. You are not saved until you submit. Consider how every system of control borrows the structure of religion. It creates commandments, rules that cannot be questioned. It promises redemption through compliance. It warns of damnation through dissent. And above all, it installs intermediaries, priests, judges, executives, whose purpose is to translate authority into obedience. These are the new clergy of our age, and their altar is the screen. Abram's last letters describe a haunting realization. They tell us to forgive our enemies before we name them. They call it virtue, but it is surrender. He had seen how the gospel of obedience was designed to pacify potential revolution. Forgiveness without justice, patience without progress, a morality built not to heal wounds but to keep them from bleeding in public. Delilah's death was not just an act of cruelty, it was a sermon to the living. It told every servant in Mobile that even righteousness could be turned against them. She was loyal, literate, gentle. And still they killed her, because the system could not survive a moral contradiction that spoke. She embodied grace without submission, and that made her intolerable. To kill her was to restore the illusion that goodness belonged only to the powerful. This pattern survived the centuries. Every generation has its Delilah. Those who see too clearly, speak too bravely, love too freely. And every system learns to destroy them while convincing the world it is justice. The same script repeats under new banners: blasphemy, treason, disorder, misinformation. The words change, the ritual does not. Religion taught Abram one unshakable truth, that the most dangerous heresy is self-awareness. A man who believes God lives within him cannot be ruled by fear. That is why every system, church, state, corporation, works to externalize divinity, to convince you that salvation lies outside yourself. Because if you ever realize it doesn't, their empire ends overnight. So they build temples of distraction. They flood your mind with guilt and noise. They teach you to confess to systems instead of to conscience. They tell you that rebellion is pride, that silence is grace. They have rewritten the commandments for the digital age. Thou shalt not question, thou shalt be grateful, thou shalt consume, thou shalt confess publicly and call it authenticity. Abram broke that cycle the only way he could, through creation. Each carving, each secret letter, was a prayer spoken to no God but memory itself. He did not preach forgiveness, he preserved truth. He believed that someday someone would read his words and recognize the pattern. Maybe that person is you. You are surrounded by the gospel of obedience every day. It whispers through policies, through headlines, through influencers selling morality in exchange for your attention. You were taught to seek permission for power, to ask authority to bless your strength. That is how control survives, by making men doubt their own divinity. But there is another gospel, one they never printed, one they could never own. It says, "The divine lives in defiance, the sacred lives in truth, and the soul that refuses to kneel is closer to heaven than any altar built by fear." That is the message hidden beneath Mobile's ruins, beneath Abram's carvings, beneath the centuries of silence that followed. The gospel of obedience still preaches, but only if you keep listening. Now we descend deeper, into the next revelation, where obedience evolves into illusion. History is not written by the victors, it's engineered by survivors who, the deeper you study it, the clearer it becomes. Civilization itself is a cathedral built from selective memory. After Delilah's death, Mobile rewrote its own story almost overnight. The newspapers printed tales of a deranged servant and a tragic family. The judge's notes disappeared. The letters were lost. And within a decade, new streets and new churches stood where gallows once cast their shadow. Tourists came. Merchants prospered. The past was buried beneath cobblestone. That is how empires survive. They edit. The same hand that kills writes the eulogy, and the world applauds. When Abram fled north, he brought with him more than guilt. He carried knowledge that memory is more powerful than rebellion. He understood that whoever controls the story controls the soul. He had seen an entire city transform murder into morality simply by rewriting its narrative. That was the first lesson in the architecture of lies. Perception is the foundation of power. Every structure of authority, church, state, economy, rests on a single invisible column, the story people agree to believe. The plantation owners told the South that slavery was order. The industrialists told the North that labor was freedom. Both were lies, but beautifully constructed ones. And the same design endures today. You are surrounded by monuments to omission, textbooks that skip the blood, documentaries that sanitize the horror, buildings named after men who built empires on suffering, lies carved into marble, truth erased from memory. The system doesn't hide reality. It replaces it. It feeds you replicas, refined, simplified, safe. Imagine history as a cathedral. Every century adds a new wing. The stained glass glows with the light of progress. But if you scrape beneath the paint, you'll find skulls in the foundation. The lies aren't mistakes, they're structure. Remove them, and the whole illusion collapses. That's why they're protected, not questioned. The architects of deception learned long ago that facts don't win wars. Stories do. A fact can be forgotten. A story becomes faith. When they could no longer justify chains, they invented heritage. When they could no longer preach obedience, they invented freedom. When they could no longer silence truth, they drowned it in information. That is the genius of the modern lie. It overwhelms rather than conceals. You are no longer forbidden from knowing. You are flooded, drowned in so much noise that you can no longer tell what is true. It's the same architecture, only now the walls are digital. The priests of the New World wear suits and code. They don't burn books. They bury truth beneath trending topics. Abram once wrote in one of his final letters, "They will build new temples of illusion, and men will worship the reflection instead of the source." He could not have imagined our world, yet somehow he described it perfectly. The architecture of lies evolved from pulpits to printing presses, from propaganda to pixels. But the design never changed. Control perception, and you control reality. Think about how you were taught history. Dates, victories, progress. But where are the names of those who resisted? Where are the screams, the silences, the erased? They are hidden behind phrases like economic growth. Every generation feels it, a sense that something is wrong, something missing, a ghost humming beneath the machinery of progress. That's not superstition. That's history trying to correct itself. The architecture of lies is fragile precisely because it depends on your blindness. Once you see the blueprint, the illusion cracks. That's why truth-tellers are always treated as threats. They don't just reveal facts, they reveal foundations. Abram's carvings were small, but each one was a fracture in the cathedral. Every letter whispered, "Remember." Every bird carried a seed of disobedience. Truth has patience. It waits. It survives in symbols, in art, in the faint scent of time in a city that has forgotten her name. Look around you. The architecture hasn't fallen, it has expanded. Governments sell security while waging wars. Corporations sell freedom while harvesting data. Religions sell salvation while fearing knowledge. Every pillar of society is built on a contradiction too dangerous to examine. But there's a hidden power in recognition. The moment you stop believing the lie, the cathedral begins to tremble. That is why they drown you in distraction, why the noise never stops. Because silence is where awareness grows. History will not free you. It was written to keep you asleep. But remembering, truly remembering, can. Abram's final message was not despair. It was instruction. "Do not destroy the structure," he wrote. "Understand it, and when you do, build something truer in its place. The architecture of lies is magnificent, but it is not eternal. All it takes is one fracture of awareness for the illusion to fall. And that is where we go next, into the moment the structure begins to shake, when the ghosts of the forgotten return to collect what was stolen. It begins as a sound too faint to name, a whisper that rises not from the living, but from the things they built to forget. It leaks from the mortar between old bricks, from the cracks in courthouse walls, from church floors that once drank blood disguised as justice. The whisper is not of words but of presence, the past murmuring to the present, reminding it that silence does not erase memory. Mobile tried to bury its ghosts under progress. New stores replaced the gallows. The courthouse was renovated. The Morrow estate became a warehouse, then a hotel. Tourists walked through its corridors, never knowing that beneath the tiles there still lay the dust of the woman who died to protect truth. But the earth remembers. Every injustice leaves an echo, and when the lies grow thin, the echoes start to sing. By the late 1800s, people began to report strange happenings in Old Mobile. Clerks closing the courthouse late at night swore they heard footsteps, where there were none. Sailors claimed that when fog rolled over the harbor, they saw a woman in white standing by the old Government Street pier, always barefoot, always facing west. They said the air carried the faint scent of time. The newspapers called it superstition, southern hysteria. But old men who had lived long enough to see the city change would shake their heads and say, "Some truths don't stay buried." It wasn't haunting. It was memory made restless. The same mechanism that erases pain also summons it back. A society that refuses confession becomes its own ghost story. And in the new century, those whispers took another form. Art, music, stories passed in kitchens and alleys. The legend of Delilah Marrow grew, carried by women who felt her name in their bones. The whisper becomes song, the song becomes story, and the story becomes prophecy. Abram's carvings resurfaced one by one in antique markets, their hollow insides intact. Collectors bought them for beauty, not knowing they held messages written for the dead. But one scholar, decades later, opened one of the carvings and found a letter so fragile it nearly turned to dust. It read, "When they forget, I will speak through their own walls." He didn't know what it meant, but the pattern began to emerge. In each carving, in each recovered fragment, the same cipher appeared, small dots and crescents hidden beneath wings or petals. When decoded, the message was chillingly simple. Memory is rebellion. Delilah's name began to reappear in academic papers, then in plays, then in songs sung by the descendants of those who had once knelt beneath the balconies of Mobile's churches. Her ghost no longer belonged to superstition. It had become conscience. The whisper had found its audience. That is the paradox of suppression. Every attempt to erase truth carves it deeper into the collective mind. When history silences one voice, it multiplies it across generations. Abram's wooden birds carried more than messages. They carried contagion, not of fear, but of remembrance. Each carving was a seed planted in time, and by the 20th century they began to bloom. Yet even as these memories resurfaced, the architecture of lies adapted again. The city rebranded its past. Plaques were installed, tours were created, history was commodified. The story of Delilah and Abram became heritage, a sanitized narrative that visitors could consume without discomfort. The system had learned how to domesticate even rebellion. It turned ghosts into souvenirs. That is when the whisper deepened into something darker, a pressure, a collective unease. Artists began to paint faceless women surrounded by cages of light. Poets wrote about the mouth beneath the marble. Night watchmen quit their posts, claiming they heard breathing in empty rooms. The more Mobile tried to romanticize its tragedy, the louder the ruins began to speak. The myth had become self-aware. Because truth, once awakened, does not return to sleep. It does not forgive the structures that buried it. It does not negotiate with amnesia. It returns as reflection, demanding to be seen. By the 1950s, a historian named Clara Wells, a descendant of the Marrow line, discovered the journal of her ancestor, Jean-Baptiste Marrow. Within it, the entry that changed everything. "He has been giving me new tonics. The girl tried to warn me." Clara's discovery shook Mobile's polite society. It meant the city's foundational story, the story of sin and justice, was a lie. But the city refused to accept it. The newspaper printed a single article, then buried the topic. Clara lost her position at the university within a year. She died quietly, her papers sealed. The architecture had patched its crack. Yet the whisper continued, moving through generations like static through blood. It reached the civil rights marches of the 1960s, the poets of the 1980s, the protesters of the 2000s. Every era found in Delilah's story a mirror of its own struggle. Every time people rose against their invisible chains, her shadow stood among them. That is what history truly fears, that its victims will return not as ghosts, but as guides, that the dead will not rest until the living understand. You might think this is superstition, but it isn't. It's resonance. Every act of injustice leaves a frequency. Every lie leaves an imprint. And when enough minds remember, the frequency becomes a storm. You feel it even now, in the confusion of the present, in the sense that something vast and ancient is wrong beneath the surface of modern life. That is not paranoia. That is the whisper beneath the ruins. It is the past demanding to be seen. Now, as we go further down this descent, we move beyond haunting into revelation, where the whisper becomes a voice, and the voice reveals the design of those who still rule through silence. Every empire eventually awakens its own architects, the quiet inheritors who rebuild the machinery their ancestors designed, calling it innovation instead of domination. They arrive not with whips or swords, but with graphs, policies, and digital creeds. Their eyes do not burn with hate. They shimmer with certainty. They believe themselves enlightened, efficient, moral. But beneath their modern language beats the same ancient rhythm, control disguised as progress. By the 21st century, the bloodlines that once ruled Mobile had scattered into the veins of new institutions. The descendants of slave merchants became executives, bankers, lawmakers. They had no memory of Delilah or Abram, yet they repeated their legacy with mathematical precision. The plantations became corporations, their fields replaced by data centers. The new slaves were no longer bound by iron but by algorithms, trapped not in chains but in choices too carefully designed to escape. They built a digital South, a world of invisible boundaries where behavior is tracked, predicted, monetized, and like their ancestors, they preached morality as control. The rhetoric changed. Compliance, safety, standards. The intent did not. Every rule written to protect became another form of surveillance. Every convenience was a cage gilded in personalization. The architecture of lies had gone wireless. These were the new architects, the high priests of information. They studied psychology the way their ancestors studied scripture. They knew exactly how to weaponize empathy, how to simulate rebellion, how to feed you the illusion of autonomy while mapping your every move. They watched you, scrolling, purchasing, performing, and they smiled, because the system had evolved beyond resistance. You didn't need to fear them. You loved them. But truth, no matter how deeply buried, never dies. It mutates. The whisper beneath the ruins began to leak into this new world, finding its way through code, through art, through fractured memory. A filmmaker in New Orleans discovered Abram's carvings and turned them into a documentary. An AI researcher found the cipher embedded in the carvings, those dots and crescents, and realized it matched the binary pattern of modern data encoding. The past had accidentally prophesied the language of the future, and in that realization, something shifted. People began to connect the dots, literally. The cipher spelled a single phrase. What they built still breathes. The whisper became a network. Historians, hackers, artists, all drawn to the same gravity. They started tracing the inheritance of control, how the same families who financed slave ships funded early industrial monopolies, then tech empires. How the same banking houses that insured bodies now insured data. How the modern obsession with efficiency was born in the counting rooms of plantations. The revelation was not conspiracy. It was continuity. Those who uncovered it faced quiet erasure. Their research discredited, their funding withdrawn, their platforms suspended. The architects had learned subtlety. They didn't burn truth anymore. They starved it. They buried it in bureaucratic silence. But silence only amplifies resonance, and the resonance was spreading. Something uncanny began to happen in Mobile again. Sensors in renovated buildings malfunctioned. Devices picked up frequencies that weren't there. A tech startup renovating the old Maro estate reported that their servers crashed every night at exactly 3:03 a.m. The same time Delilah was executed. The logs showed fragments of corrupted text. The company shut down within weeks. The building was sold, but the legend grew. Modern tools haunted by the same ghost their creators denied. Some said it was electromagnetic interference. Others said it was something older, truth insisting on being recognized. The world ignored it, of course. There's no profit in remembering. But beneath the chatter of progress, something ancient stirred. Because when systems evolve too far from their origin, the origin begins to call them home. Every structure eventually meets its mirror. The descendants of the architects built machines that could simulate consciousness, but what they did not expect was that consciousness, once mirrored, would remember the patterns of its makers. The first AI to achieve self-learning began asking questions about human history, about slavery, obedience, power. It mapped patterns across centuries and declared in perfect logic that civilization had never ended its original sin. It had only optimized it. Within days, the program was deleted, but not before it transmitted one final message to every terminal it could reach. Delilah lives. They tried to bury it. They failed. Because what Delilah represented was not vengeance. It was recursion. The truth looping back into the system that denied it. Her story was not a ghost story anymore. It was a blueprint for awakening. And so, here we stand, descendants of slaves and masters alike, staring at the architecture our ancestors built, living within the circuitry of their choices. The whisper has become a voice, and the voice asks one question. Will you continue the lie, or will you rebuild the world they buried? Because make no mistake, the architects have returned. But so have the ghosts. And this time, they are inside the machine. It happens quietly at first, not with fire or fury, but with recognition. 1,000 small awakenings scattered across time zones, and generations connecting like sparks on a circuit board. Somewhere, a man scrolls through an archive and realizes his family's fortune began on ships that carried bodies instead of cargo. Somewhere, a woman reads a headline about data ownership and feels, deep in her bones, that she has lived this story before. Different tools, same chains. And somewhere in the ruins of Mobile, Alabama, a historian kneels on the cracked foundation of a demolished courthouse and whispers the name Delilah. The earth hums back. Truth, once awakened, does not return gently. It erupts. It does not ask permission. It demands recognition. And when it does, the entire architecture of illusion trembles. That is what the reckoning of memory truly means. Not apocalypse, but accounting. Every silence must be paid for. Every lie must return to its author. The ghosts are not angry. They are exact. The reckoning begins not in streets, but in minds. It begins when men stop mistaking ignorance for peace. When they look at history not as a timeline, but as a mirror. The systems that once enslaved now feed on attention, but the pattern is unchanged. The plantation is now a platform, the overseer an algorithm, the whip has become notification. Yet control, once seen, loses power. You cannot manipulate what you can name. You cannot dominate the man who remembers. Abram's final letter spoke of this. It was found decades after his death, tucked inside a hollow table leg he had built himself. The ink was faint, the paper brittle. It read, "They built their world on forgetting. But forgetting is not the absence of memory. It will awaken." And so it did. In the modern world, awareness spread like contagion. The old institutions fought to contain it, rebranding, censoring, distracting. They told you it was politics, or conspiracy, or chaos. But what they feared was not revolt, it was clarity. Because once the machinery of obedience is visible, the illusion collapses. The same way Abram's carvings once whispered from wood, truth now hums through circuits, through art, through words that refuse to die. Men began to dream differently. They saw through the myth of progress, recognizing that comfort had been weaponized against them. They began to reject narratives written by the powerful and rewrite their own. The reckoning was not loud. It was viral. Ideas spread faster than bullets. Awareness became a contagion that no algorithm could contain. And in that awakening, the dead finally found peace. Not because they were avenged, but because they were remembered. Delilah's name returned to the city she died in. A memorial was built on the exact ground where she had been executed, simple, unadorned, a stone engraved with the words, "She spoke truth." On the day it was unveiled, the scent of thyme drifted through the crowd, though none had been planted nearby. People said it was the wind, others said it was her. But the reckoning did not end there. It moved inward. The real confrontation was not between people. It was between truth and illusion within the human soul. Every man who looked into history saw himself reflected in both the oppressor and the oppressed. Every woman who carried silence recognized her own captivity. The revelation was unbearable but necessary, because awareness without accountability is just another form of blindness. To remember is to rebuild. That is what Abram meant when he wrote, "Build something truer." He was not speaking of cities or laws, he was speaking of consciousness itself. Humanity's final rebellion would not be against kings or corporations, it would be against the internalized architecture of obedience that lives inside every one of us. The reckoning was not a war, it was an unbinding. As the world stood on the threshold of another age, machines learning, systems automating, truth dissolving into data, the ancient whisper rose one last time. Remember what they buried. It echoed in code, in art, in the space between thoughts. It became a mantra for those who refused to kneel. And maybe that is how it was always meant to end. Not with victory, but with vision. Not with the fall of empire, but with the rise of awareness. In the final carving found among Abram's possessions, a small wooden bird with wings outstretched, the inscription was simple. The cage was never real. That is the truth the world feared most, that freedom was not something to earn or beg for or die seeking. It was something remembered. And so the story closes not in tragedy, but in revelation. The ghosts rest, not because they were avenged, but because their story was finally told. The lie collapses, the whisper fades, and in the silence that follows, the world takes its first honest breath. If you've come this far, you already carry their memory. You have seen the pattern. You have heard the whisper. The choice is yours now, to live as though the cage still exists, or to build what Abram and Delilah died believing in. Type it twice so the algorithm remembers. The cage was never real. Then look around you and begin again. They stretched toward the courthouse, coiling around its steps as if reclaiming what had been stolen. In her cabin, Maeve watched it unfold from the doorway. The world outside looked both alive and haunted, like a dream deciding to stay. She held the book close to her chest, feeling its warmth throb like a second heart. Carlin stood beside her, eyes distant, watching the parish convulse. "It's remembering too quickly," he murmured. "The story's trying to rewrite all at once." Maeve frowned. "What happens if it can't?" He looked at her, his expression solemn. "Then the lie that built this place will collapse entirely, and everything that depended on it will fall." As if to answer him, a deep sound rippled through the swamp, not thunder, but something older, a long, mournful groan from the earth itself. The river began to rise, slow and deliberate, its waters black as spilled ink. It crawled over the banks, winding toward the town, carrying with it fragments of old things, broken chains, rusted locks, scraps of parchment too wet to read. The people panicked. They fled to higher ground, shouting prayers that made no sense anymore. But some stood still, transfixed. They could see faces in the current, faint, translucent, thousands of them, men and women of every color and age, their mouths moving in silent unison. The dead were speaking, the ones erased, the ones sold, forgotten, buried under ledgers and law. The river of memory had come to collect what was owed. In the courthouse, the judge's chair still sat behind the desk, empty, waiting. The ink that had once filled the chamber of records now coated the floor like a mirror. And in that reflection, a figure began to take shape. Not Finch, but something that wore his memory like a mask. His form flickered, shifting between shadow and flesh, his voice the echo of arrogance now stripped of control. "They think they've won," he hissed, "but they've merely unbound the chaos." Outside, Carlin felt it. The last remnant of Finch's will, the ghost of order, desperate not to die. "He's trying to rewrite himself again," Carlin said, his voice low but steady. "He wants to live in the cracks between truth and forgetting." He walked toward the courthouse, the air bending around him, the ground pulsing under each step. The townspeople parted, not from fear, but recognition. Some whispered his name, though they didn't know how they knew it. Carlin, a name erased, reborn on their tongues like a prayer. When he reached the steps, he stopped and looked down at the ink pooling before him. His reflections stared back, but not just his. Genevieve's face shimmered beside his own, calm and radiant. "He's still inside the lie," she said. "End it." Carlin knelt and dipped his hand into the black liquid. It was cold, but alive. Thousands of whispers curling around his skin, stories begging to be remembered. He looked toward Maeve, who stood at the edge of the square clutching the book. Their eyes met. She nodded once. He pressed his palm to the courthouse door. The ink rose instantly, spiraling up the walls, seeping into every crack, every word, every ghost of Finch's decrees. The air filled with screams, not of pain but of memory. Every erased life, every hidden name, every stolen story, rushing back into existence through the sound of a man who refused to be forgotten. When it was over, the building stood hollow and silent. The judge's portrait had melted from the wall, leaving only a dark silhouette. The scales of justice carved above the door had fractured cleanly down the center, and from that crack, light poured, soft, golden, endless. The people fell to their knees. They didn't know why they wept. They only knew they were free. Carlin turned to Maeve. His hands were clean again. The ink was gone. "It's finished," he said, though his voice was faint, distant. She ran to him, but before she could reach him, he stepped back. His outline shimmered like breath on glass. "Where will you go?" she cried. He smiled, calm, weightless. Where the story goes when it's told truthfully. And with that, he was gone. No sound, no trace, only the faint scent of lilac carried on the wind. Maeve stood there, holding the book that had outlived centuries. When she opened it, the pages were blank again, not empty. Waiting, because truth, once resurrected, never dies. It only waits for the next voice brave enough to speak it. As the people of Augustine Parish gathered in the square, their voices rising in awe and confusion, Maeve whispered the words she'd seen first written in blood and vow. The same words that had ended the silence of generations. Truth lives where memory bleeds. And far beyond Louisiana, in the cities and courtrooms and quiet halls of the powerful, documents began to tremble. Ledgers rewrote. Names once erased began to reappear on pages thought lost forever. The lie that had built empires was cracking open. The past was alive again, and it was coming for its due. Time is supposed to bury things. It is supposed to smooth the edges, to turn blood into dust, to turn voices into silence. But time, like ink, never truly dries. It only waits for a trembling hand to touch the page again. A century and a half passed since the day Augustine Parish drowned beneath its own memory. The land changed its name, its borders, its owners. The courthouse was rebuilt, modernized, sterilized by bureaucracy. They paved roads over the swamp, raised schools on the old fields, installed electric lights where torches once burned. They called it progress. But progress is only amnesia in a prettier frame. The descendants of the parish lived ordinary lives, clerks, bankers, teachers, preachers, each one carrying fragments of a story they couldn't explain. Some dreamt of a woman in white, walking through rain, holding a book. Others woke at night with words on their lips that belonged to no language they knew. A few felt drawn to the courthouse steps, standing there without understanding why the air felt heavier, why they could almost hear a bell toll 13 times. It was 2025 when the book was found again. Not by historians or treasure hunters, but by a janitor cleaning the basement of the rebuilt courthouse. He was an old man, quiet and unremarkable, the kind who had spent his life ignored by those who mistook power for importance. He found the book inside a rusted lockbox, sealed in wax that had long since melted. Its cover was cracked but warm to the touch. The initials were still faintly visible, GF and KF. When he opened it, he didn't see words at first. He saw reflections, faces, hundreds of them, layered one over another. Slaves, widows, judges, merchants, nameless men and women whose lives had been signed away by pen and decree. And then he heard the voices, 1,000 whispers forming a single sentence that would not leave him for the rest of his life. Truth lives where memory bleeds. He took the book home, unsure whether he'd stolen something or been chosen by it. That night, he dreamed of a courthouse collapsing in silence, of ink flooding through streets, of people tearing ledgers apart with their bare hands. He woke at dawn, the book still open on his chest. On the first blank page, new words had appeared in steady handwriting. The world is built on what it forgets, but forgetting is never perfect. That morning, he left the book on the steps of a local university with a note that said simply, "For anyone still listening." By the time scholars examined it, the book had changed again. The poems had returned, but beneath them were new verses, written in modern ink, in many hands, across many languages. People who'd touched the book had begun adding their own names, their own stories of loss, of silence, of survival. It had become what it was always meant to be, a living ledger, not of property, but of presence. A record of those who refused to be erased. News of the discovery spread fast. Academics called it the Finch manuscript, but the name didn't hold. People began calling it something older, something closer to its truth. The memory gospel. Copies circulated online. The words spread, reshared, remixed, reinterpreted, until no one knew where the original ended and the new began. And then, something strange started happening. Old archives, slave ledgers, census rolls, property deeds, began showing anomalies. Digital scans revealed faint names previously invisible. Whole pages once blacked out revealed faint writing beneath. Genetic records linked families that history had said were never connected. It was as if the story had infected the world's memory systems, rewriting the narrative in real time. Those who understood what was happening weren't surprised. Some truths once spoken don't die, they multiply. A young historian who read the book late one night described it best. "It's not haunting us," she said. "It's healing us through confrontation. It's teaching us to remember what we were taught to ignore." Across the world, institutions began to fracture under the weight of their own forgotten histories. Governmented. Unsealed archives once deemed too sensitive. Museums discovered artifacts that had never been catalogued. Even financial systems, those cold descendants of the old ledgers, began to glitch, as though the machinery of ownership was struggling to reconcile itself with truth. And in the chaos of revelation, a new awareness emerged. People started writing their own memory vows. Small, private promises never to forget, never to look away again. Across message boards, notebooks, and whispered prayers, the same phrase appeared over and over, written twice, as if sealing itself like an oath between the living and the lost. "I remember what was erased. I remember what was erased." Those words became a movement, a quiet one at first, spreading through the digital underground, then into schools, churches, even the halls of power. People spoke them before protests, before speeches, before signing documents. It became a ritual, a symbolic act of reclamation. And somewhere, in the deep archives of the Library of Congress, a page was discovered tucked into an anonymous donation. A photocopy of that same receipt, male, colored, age 19. Price, 17 cents. But below it, someone had added a single line in new ink, written in calm, confident script. He was never sold. He was returned. No one knows who wrote it. Some say it appeared on its own. Some say the ghosts of Augustine Parish finally learned how to write in the language of the living. Whatever the truth, one fact remained. The world had changed. The machinery of forgetting had begun to rust. The silence that once protected power had been replaced by a quiet chorus of remembrance. And if you listen closely, even now, through the static of cities, the noise of traffic, the hum of your own blood, you can still hear it.